Like Danny and I at this tournament, we think humanity has peaked. We think the economic greed that has outlived the incentive for people to be helped as a result of making profits. We think that humanity has reached a point where irreversible harms have happened to the very existence of it, but at the very least, the very structures of our society, which means that even if humanity does exist, it's significantly worse 100 years from now. Two things in this speech. Firstly, on climate change and why we think the massive, devastating effects of climate change are irreversible and irreparable and cause incredible amounts of harm in this debate. And secondly, on economic inequality and why we think that the increase in economic inequality that's likely and irreversible in the next 100 years means that even if benefits accrue to humanity, it's always going to accrue to the top and never to the rest of humanity. What is the criteria, however, that you should judge this debate? We think it's quite simple. It should be the quality of life of the average person and of humanity as a whole, right? It's obviously things like literal conditions on the ground, aka the amount of money and those kinds of things that you have, the ability, for example, to have air that you can breathe and those kinds of things. But also secondly, things like agency and your ability to control freedoms and the lives that you live and those kinds of things, right? So both of these things that we think are probably the most objective way to measure things like happiness and contentment, which we think define the human experience and what it means to be preferable. But also second,
information.
Yeah, is that a clarification? No. Okay. Given this is not it's not sufficient for opposition, for example, to prove that right now suffering, for example, might be high. Even if that is the case, they need to prove why the net suffering on their side of the house 100 years from now is significantly going to be lesser than it is right now if they want to win this debate. Let's talk then about climate change. Four things to talk about here in terms of climate change. The first thing to talk about is that it's already reached the irreversible point. That is, a couple of years ago, we've already reached the carbon amount per 100 million. That's in the atmosphere, carbon dioxide amount per parts per million in the atmosphere. That's necessary for us to be able to reverse this change, right? So what we're doing right now is at best mitigatory and at worst damaging. But secondly, it's the fact that literally we haven't developed the technology that exists in order to solve these problems. Even if we can start right now, right? The fact is, all of the technology that we have and all the methods that we try have been incredibly counterproductive, if at all, but at best have been marginally mitigatory. Things like carbon capture have been incredibly mitigatory in the ways in which we want to prevent climate change and have done nothing but slow down an incredibly accelerating process. Thirdly, it's things like renewable energy that we presumably think is a solution, often doesn't replace and often doesn't reverse these effects, right? It at best makes these effects slightly less net negative, which means you're still moving towards a world which is devastated by the effects of climate change. But lastly, why are these things unlikely to change on their side of the house? Firstly, the sheer collective action problem that exists in terms of the unwillingness for countries to want to solve climate change, right? Firstly, it's because of the fact that empirically this is true, right? Countries like the US with Trump or like Bolsonaro in Brazil pulling out of the Paris Accords, meaning that every single other country is harmed by the fact that this accord is no longer binding, right? Recognize the sheer amount of collective action that's required on the collective of humanity in order to be able to solve this problem, and the mere fact that a few actors are able to leave this accord means that everyone else suffers. But secondly, the reason why the collective action problem is always going to exist is it's twofold, right? The first is that you can be affected by other people's negligence, which means there's no reason for you to act in a way that benefits climate change, because of the fact that Singapore is still screwed over when Indonesia burns down forests and that the pollution flows over to them, right? Which means there's no reason for you as a rational actor in order to do this thing when you have no incentive or no belief or no empirical evidence to suggest that other actors are going to behave in a profitable way. But lastly, it's things like politicians always have to cater to the short-term incentives of people that are living on the ground because they want to do things like win elections. The thing that people care most about is things like jobs, right? And being able to put money on their table, which means the kinds of economic development happen particularly in the developing world, which constitutes the vast percentage of the population of the world, is one that's incredibly devastating and damaging. It's like massive manufacturing and burning of fossil fuels, which means that these effects are likely to happen. What are the impacts of this? A few things to talk about here. Firstly, in terms of the impacts, right? One, recognize that given that most predictions have things like coastlines or most coastlines around the world being inundated within the next 40 to 50 years, presumably in 100 years, the vast majority of livable land that exists on this earth is going to be inundated by rising sea levels, which means you don't have earth to live in, right? But secondly, it's things like air pollution and water pollution are at absolute worst, right? Because of the fact that even if they want to talk about economic development, recognize that economic development is tied to these things, right? Which is why Beijing, for example, is probably the worst polluted among all of China. The reality is those kinds of things means that pollution is going to be significantly worse. Thirdly, it's things like resource shortages and famines that happen due to things like increasing things like earthquakes earthquakes or like droughts and those kinds of things, which means that resources are significantly lesser. What are the harms of this? The first thing to talk about is things like massive resource wars that are likely to happen all across the earth as a result of the fact that resources are incredibly scarce that exist, right? Because of the fact that there's constant insecurity in countries that are unable to provide food for their people or air for them to breathe, right? Secondly, it's the fact that people, it's on top of all of these effects, the fact that people feel no agency over these things. The fact that you're always screwed over by the governments of the past that you have no control over. You're always screwed over by the people at the top, even if you want control right now, and you're never able to change these things, which also additionally has a multiplier effect on these things. At best, what we think is a solution that's likely to happen is people are able, for example, to leave Earth, recognizing that Earth probably doesn't exist. The problem with this argument, however, is that the people who are likely to leave are the wealthy oligarchs who can make sure that they can get a place on the ship that presumably leaves this Earth, right? Which means that one, recognizing it's incredibly principally problematic that these are the people who are going to be benefiting off of this, but also two, that the number of people in and of itself is a factor in this debate, right? We argue that perhaps like the fact that humanity is down to like 1,000 people in and of itself is an incredibly unpreferable condition to one in which there are a lot more. Closing.
So how do nation states look like 100 years from now? Do they still exist, and to what point are they different from the status quo?
We don't know. What we're arguing is regardless of how they exist, they will not have land and air. So it doesn't matter. Economic inequality. First, you recognize it's empirically been increasing all around the world, and I've heard this presumably somewhere else. It's because capital is excluding and self-propagating, right? What are the reasons for this? One, people often money is self-reproducing, which means the rich keep getting richer in status quo, right? Secondly, it's things like political advantages, which is often right now and more than ever tied to your economic power, and it's going to increase. Like things like, for example, Citizens United, meaning that corporations have control over the political landscape of the United States, for example, and most of the rest of the world. But thirdly, first mover advantage, which means that even if, for example, things that exist that allow you to radically change the way in which capital happens, the people who are always going to get that benefit are going to be the ones at the top who have the most money and the most political power and the most information, which means that any of ops benefits are unlikely to go to the people who need it the most, because they're always taken away by the people who have the most power and the most money, which means also you're able to control citizens, for example, which is like China, right, which is things like your ability to track these citizens to make sure they're not out of order, to make sure there's censorship, which means people can never speak out against these things. We think humanity has peaked. We're very proud to propose.
The arc of history tends towards equality, it tends towards justice, and it tends towards morality, and that's because time brings things like an increase in capital, which increases the pie for everybody, no matter how it is distributed. It brings things like an increase in innovation, which not only do we think is likely to be able to deal with the kind of climate change we hear about at opening government, but also will deal with things like diseases that ravage people on a day-to-day basis, deal with things like malnutrition that currently we can't even begin to comprehend. And all of this happens in a world which is increasingly connected, where it's increasingly easy to hear an everyday person's voice, and where governments of the world are tied to other governments of the world, such that we see things like difficulties in creating war and an incentive to help out the economies of everybody. Even the most dire predictions of opening government, which we will contest, do not deal with the kind of oppression that we see in our world today, do not deal with the kind of absolute poverty that we see in the world today, and we will explain to you why, at opening opposition, these things are likely to be, to a large extent, eradicated in 100 years. The first point that we're bringing you at opening opposition is that the arc of history continues to tend towards justice. And let's note the causes of injustice in this world. It's things like, I'm sure, things like economic threats, it's things like a lack of communication, and often I think it is just people not having comprehended that certain individuals deserve rights or that certain individuals aren't being treated as an equal. We think the mere passage of time makes lots of these things better. Why is that? Well, if we looked at things like minority rights, we'd know factually issues for, say, women or for people of colour are, in a general sense, getting better each year. We think that in many cases this is because as the shock factor of the claim that, say, LGBT individuals deserve rights gets smaller, the ability to have actual policies change the way in which people are considered in society or treated in society gets better. It's things like being able to see, even by a freak accident, a woman in power or a person of colour in power, allowing children to change the way in which they perceive people who are not like them. And on top of all of this, we would note that that the ease of people who have been structurally oppressed to access education means that those individuals are more empowered to demand for their rights and more empowered to explain to oppressors why it is that they deserve those rights. That's things that comes from like an increase in access to internet in some of the poorest countries in the world. That's things like an increasing push to make higher education accessible. We think that just things like literacy rates booming in some of the poorest countries in the world makes minority rights better off. Secondly, we think that developments in medical advancement helps justice in the sense that people are no longer unfairly struck down by disease. We know, for instance, that big catchphrases like "we will cure cancer" are becoming increasingly clear. And even if now, for instance, the immunotherapy that won the Nobel Prize is expensive, it will be significantly less expensive in 100 years when that technology has become normal, when that technology, for instance, has patents taken away. And we know also that many of the diseases that people, for instance, in Southeast Asia die from today, like respiratory illnesses, are increasingly being dealt with by the fact that we're getting better at distributing antibiotics. We think that those kind of structural changes are getting better, and in 100 years, an increase in knowledge about these issues, an increase in people caring about these issues, will mean that we can distribute these kind of medical technologies. Thirdly, we think that there is a strong trend towards democracy, which is making humanity better. We would factually know this is the case when you look at democracies or nascent democracies, and we note that as people get wealthier, there is an increase in demand for this. Backslide does happen, but it is far harder to go from democracy to dictatorship than dictatorship to democracy. And even to the extent that this government bench might want to argue that democracy is becoming weaker, things like increased education and increased communication means that even weak democracies are getting better at responding to the people than previously strong democracies where individuals literally could not speak out. They cannot point to blips in this. The structural things are that education and wealth makes this better. Finally, in a global sense, we think that peace is getting better. Increased globalization means you have fewer incentives for wars and populations are becoming more intertwined. Compare this to the harms of opening opposition to do with climate change. First, we note that factually, many of their claims are not true. It is true that we have passed a point of no return. It is not true that that point of no return leads us to doomsday. We think that there are many reasons to believe that the technological advancements towards climate change will be exponential, since if we do manage to do things like carbon capture or things like hydrogen power, which would also be carbon negative, that will be caught on quickly. And even if it is unfortunate that it might take more than what is currently happening to get, say, the US to take more notice, we think that when, for instance, Miami starts flooding, there will be voters demanding the fact that they need climate change action, and that will likely be exponential, just like we need. We think that legislation in 164 countries has been passed. Solar is the cheapest form of energy. 2/3 of energy have been added to the market, have been renewable since 2016. The world is getting a better place, especially for the most vulnerable. Closing.
Do you think people now, or people 100 years ago, were more resilient to suffering?
Well, first of all, that is irrelevant if people are suffering exponentially more 100 years ago. We'd prefer a weak person who wasn't starving to a strong person who was, or a strong person who didn't have the law protecting them. But second of all, don't be ridiculous. They are more resilient now. They can access education that teaches them how to be resilient. They can have support networks and they're not constantly degraded. It is far more important to eat than to be resilient. Why is it then, secondly, that humanity, we think, will be significantly less poor? Let's note, poverty, absolute poverty has halved in the past 20 years and the past 20 years before that. We think that countrywide gradual accumulation of profit, of capital in poor countries is being seen, and we think on an individual level, things like increases in technology and education is helping these individuals. Even if disparity is increasing, the fact that the pie is becoming so much bigger means that we think things like absolute poverty are decreasing now and will continue to decrease into the future. But actually, technological advancement, which is increasingly targeting the most well-off people, means that the state actually is increasingly having an incentive for a safety net. So even if the Industrial Revolution hurt the poorest of people, the current technological revolution is hurting the wealthiest people, and that is exactly what's going to mean that states will take care of the vulnerable people. This is on top of improvements in health, improvements in nutrition, and improvements in education, which are helping all of these people live a better life. Let's not ignore those people who are suffering on a day-to-day basis now. What they need is not resilience, they need food. They will only get that in 100 years, and that's why that's absolutely preferable.
Imagine for a moment that this motion was set at Worlds 1919. It would be a simple cut and paste job to transform the PM speech on that motion to the PM speech today. You just replace climate change with acid rain. So the problem is the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting the picture, and then you worry about overpopulation and the Industrial Revolution. Our capacity to wave our hands and stress about these problems is immense, but our ability to underestimate the huge technological progress is also very important in this debate. And given that historical context, the government bench needs to show something far more worrying than they've done so far. First question I'll ask is, how do we assess the specific challenges facing humanity? Set against the long arc of history, the burden should be on the government teams to explain why we expect humanity to take a sudden U-turn. Opening government has pursued that through the possibility of climate change. The first problem with this argument is that the case for climate change pessimism is weak. Their arguments could also have been used to explain why we'd never fix the hole in the ozone layer in the 1970s, immediately before the Montreal Protocol was introduced, that has now seen the hole in the ozone layer mitigated to basically zero, or that acid rain would intensify up until Europe and the United States signed the Convention on Long-Range Air Pollution. Firstly, states can avoid collective action problems by making binding agreements, like the binding agreements that China is currently pushing for and that a number of developing countries have already assented to. Secondly, political incentives are shifting towards climate change because political parties are short-termers, but also have an incentive to care about their legacy because they don't want to be seen as the party that ruins humanity's future, which is why empirically we now see carbon pricing in over 40 jurisdictions. Thirdly, although there are some current irreversible effects of climate change, they can be resolved by continued technological improvements, like for example through cloud seeding and carbon capture. Opening government says we don't currently have the technology. Correct, that's why we're talking about technological improvements. Consider for instance the fact that the United States was capable of creating an Ebola vaccine 1 month after the risk of Ebola arrived in serious terms, and it's clear there will be a huge monetary incentive to push it towards that technology, which is why, for example, we already see that green energy is cheaper than the alternatives. But the bigger problem with the argument is that even accepting the most dire predictions of climate change, on net, human beings will be much better off in 100 years' time. And no, the most dire predictions aren't there will be literally 1,000 people left to walk the earth. Certainly not. Realistically, like a 2-degree warming, the realistic worst case scenario set out by the IPCC, for example, is to talk about the possibility of there being 100 million plus climate change refugees. That would be a terrible outcome, to be clear. However, the world would still be a way better place if you believe that global poverty would continue to be far less likely among the billion global poor, and women would be far less likely to be subject to sexual assault, for example. The second possibility is that they might talk about artificial intelligence, and here I'm going to lodge some more substantive, particularly in respect of what might come out of closing government. The first thing we say is that artificial intelligence in 100 years is very likely to be servile to our interests. And the reason for that is that most predictions don't think AI will be nearly able to displace us for well over 100 years. And given that we have historically been optimistic about how quickly we could get artificial intelligence to, for example, beat us at playing chess, there is a reason to think that those estimates are at the lower range of how quick progress will be, rather than being at the upper range. And that also reflects a number of structural barriers to the development of artificial intelligence. For instance, that we're nowhere near the level of computing power we would require for human beings to be fully displaced by artificial intelligence, and also the fact that there's a financial incentive that tends towards very domain-specific artificial intelligence. So that's why it'll be humans being displaced from specific jobs like driving, rather than humans being displaced from social and political structures. And clearly, since human beings are concerned with the sci-fi kind of displacement scenario, there is a strong interest in regulating artificial intelligence, which is what we already see under the status quo. Realistically, the continued progress of artificial intelligence looks like displacing jobs. Yes, that might mean that there's an increase in inequality, as opening governments say, just like the Industrial Revolution, for instance, caused an increase in inequality, but it also means that the poorest are better off because the pie is so much bigger. But also, this is more likely to make inequality better because unlike the Industrial Revolution, the artificial intelligence revolution is targeting those in the highest skilled and best paid positions, which means that there's a strong political incentive to design strong safety nets that are going to ensure that these people benefit. Weigh the very uncertain, speculative, existential threats of the government bench against the certainty of continued economic progress and better minority rights, and ask yourself which side is coming up ahead. Secondly, how will global prosperity be shared in 100 years? The premise of opening government, the wealth only goes to the rich, is factually wrong, as we can see from our current status quo steps in halving global poverty over the last 20 years and the 20 years before that. One, even in the most dictatorial states, there is an incentive towards wealth sharing because you clearly care about the stability of your state, for example. Secondly, most sources of technological improvement are immediately shared with the poor without the state needing to do anything. So, for instance, the huge decline in electricity costs means that more people are able to feed their children without the state needing to do anything, just as a natural consequence of technological improvement. Given the huge benefit that we get to the material quality of life of individuals, even if they are more distressed in an existential way, for example, their ability to feed and clothe their children will make the standard of living far, far better. Closing.
Increases in technology have allowed dominant corporations to control the information that people receive and to capture politicians through things like political donations. Why would that mean that in 100 years the democracies that you stand up for are likely to be captured by the interests of big business and not the people?
Well, the first observation I would make is that even if it were to be, a society that is far richer and has far better respect for minority rights, even if it was much less democratic, we still have some incentive to share the benefits of the pie. Which is why, for example, compare China today to the United Kingdom 100 years ago. Only an idiot would prefer to live in the United Kingdom 100 years ago. Like, the quality of life is very different. In the provinces of China that have been the beneficiaries of the economic miracle, which our case has been that many people will be. But I'm also going to respond to this in my points, my last bit of, the last issue, which is about the status of minority rights. Open government's claim that women only got rights because of a compromise with elites ignores the incredible success of the women's rights movement in ensuring rights for women. But even if it was a compromise, it's probably a good compromise that has made half of humanity much better off, and we explain why it's likely to continue. Let's talk about the tendency to democracy. They say sometimes people backslide. What I'm going to say in my substantive is that technology has a tendency towards giving people agency rather than giving states power, which will also respond to that point of information. Firstly, technology means greater access to information because it means that information has much lower fixed costs. So, for example, it will be harder for governments of the future to regulate news that majority happens online than it is under the status quo when you can shut down the printing presses, which means there is a much smaller number of outlets. Secondly, as information and societies grow more globalized, it will be increasingly harder to just rely on nationalistic rhetoric and national extremism, because when people are capable of communicating all over the world, it will be harder to convince people that they should, for instance, go to war. Lastly, the increased trajectory towards educational access means it is more likely people will be able to pursue their democratic freedoms. We are richer, safer, freer than we ever have been, and we will be 100 years in 100 years' time as well. We oppose.
First question I'm going to ask is how corporations will come to capture the world in 100 years' time. Note that this argument responds very neatly to opening opposition for two reasons. Firstly, because they may be able to say that problems like climate change might be solved with technology in the future, but this argument will prove that advances in the technology only make the problem of corporate capture worse. And secondly, for the reason that the democratic victories which they stand for are empty and hollow ones, if it is the case that the women or the people of colour that are placed on corporate boards are servile to the interests of capital and the corporations that place them there and not their own democratic mandate. Why is it that corporations will capture the world? Firstly, failure of government regulation. Because currently, the vast amounts of capital that corporations hold means that they are able to advance extraordinary coercive power over politics through things like political donations and lobbying, and working for government bodies which shape the policies that people have to endure. And secondly, the unwillingness of governments to sacrifice the short-term economic gain that comes with things like deregulation, which means that each successive government has no incentive to be the one government that cops the harm of having corporations lobby against it. Secondly, the reason of increasing inequality, because the capital that people currently have means that they are able to purchase the means of investment, like factories in the developing world, and control the lives of people there. Thirdly, because increases in technology will make challenging the dominant corporations that exist in society currently more difficult, through things like patenting laws that, again, governments have very little incentive to reform because of the political backlash that they would have to endure from corporations, through things like the sources of wealth becoming more sophisticated and therefore more difficult for the public to scrutinise and regulate, like the fact that investment banks now invest in complex derivatives that no one understands, as opposed to the previous years. Fourthly, and because of the enormous asymmetries of information that the development of technology has created. Because opening opposition says people now have more access to information, and it is plausibly true that the barriers to cost are reduced under the status quo and will be reduced into the future. The problem is you have to ask who controls that access to information, and it is corporations who use algorithms to feed people news that they cannot monitor, who are dependent on advertising dollars and therefore have every incentive to sell products to you instead of selling news that might help overthrow the types of control that they exert over society. Finally, because the advancement of corporate ideology that soothes the populace into not considering the possibility of alternatives, because the existence of things like brands and the constant advertising that people have to endure in every public space that they have, that they experience in society, means that the primary goal of each individual in a capitalistic world, like the one that we live in now, is to accumulate more stuff, to accumulate more capital, that every brand and every advertiser has an incentive to push to you as being the thing that will make you happy. And that's precisely the reason that feminism has been captured by corporations to be about clothing and the type of lipstick that you wear, instead of engagement with broad social movements that actually implement the types of change that would benefit women. What is the problem with this? Firstly, it results in far greater inequality than opening opposition countenances in this debate. Because their response to our point of information is like, well, there are some provinces of China that get richer. Our point is that every province of China, every region of the world is more likely to be the ones that do not benefit from the economic miracle. And that is particularly likely to be the case when advancements in things like artificial intelligence make workers increasingly obsolete and therefore useless to the state and useless to corporations, and they lose every incentive to feed them. Secondly, because of the regulation of government by a set of elites robs people of every democratic power that they have to control the policies that govern their own lives. And yes, it is true, people might still get to go to the government ballot box under their side. You might still see female politicians. The problem with that is that that is all a hollow choice. It's one that has already been determined by corporations that have used their lobbying power to exert influence over government and get the outcomes that they desire. And finally, it instills in people an idea that they are only equivalent to the money that they have, especially as society becomes more inequality and the distinction between the good people and the bad people, or the rich people and the poor people, becomes more distinct. That is the first and major reason that closing government wins this debate. Secondly, on artificial intelligence, before that, yeah, go for it.
This is also true comparing 2019 to 1919. Assuming there's more corporate control today, does that outweigh almost 1 billion people lifted out of poverty and women given safety and protection from violence?
I would say that the types of developments that we are talking about are extraordinarily different from the types of developments that people could have countenanced in 1919. The types of technology, the types of control over information, the types of complexities of the capitalist system in which people live that obscure its injustices from the rest of the population of the world are enormously different to those that we could have even countenanced in 1919. Secondly, on artificial intelligence, we are in an unprecedented period of technological explosion, and it's weird that opening opposition's preemptive response to the argument about artificial intelligence is to say, well, it's unlikely that it's going to exist in the form that we claim it does 100 years in the future, even though they're very happy to claim that we will solve climate change in the future, which seems to suggest that the pace of their technological development is much more likely to be very rapid. And we know that is the case because the number of capacitors that we can fit onto a microchip, for instance, is not growing linearly, it's growing exponentially to the extent where scientists do estimate that we'll have enough processing power to simulate a human brain by 2050. What's the problem with the development of artificial intelligence? Firstly, it's difficult to regulate AI because corporations have incredibly large incentives to be aggressive in their research of AI, because they have the first mover advantage of being the first person being able to patent an algorithm, and governments would not ban it because corporations could justify them to the public by saying things like they provide large short-term economic benefits by helping automate certain processes and making the economy more efficient. And it's incredibly difficult to program an artificial intelligence program whose goals align with human clients, because things like morality are very difficult to program into a set of instructions that you can tell an AI. It's very difficult to predict how an artificial intelligence is likely to react to the set of circumstances that you give it, given that it's a kind of code that then magically kind of transforms into outputs that might not be fully understood. So either it is likely that humanity in the future will be destroyed by the grey goop that will consume us all, or even if that is not plausible, it is likely that governments or corporations will use those artificial intelligences to wreak huge havoc on humanity. Imagine the devastation that is likely to be caused by an artificial intelligence that governments can program to tell you to shut off the entire electricity grid of a country, and it's likely to be able to do so given that it has exponentially expanding processing power because they can improve themselves. Or, at best for opening opposition, a tiny proportion of people who are lucky enough to be able to research those things in time, who control the patents to those technologies, control the vast majority of wealth, and do not find the individuals who continue to exist in society useful because they no longer provide useful labour to them. This shackles the future will be one in which humanity is shackled to the force of capitalism and shackled to artificial intelligence. That's what we propose.
Zagreb A intends to prove it takes just two. It's probably going to be quite easy considering that every team in this debate has failed to engage with the crux of it. Note that the rise of knowledge is uncomparative on both sides because, yes, technology is going to progress. The thing with technology is we have more problems that are specific to the new technology that we create, and the question remains how we're going to use that technology, whether it's going to be good or bad. That depends on how empathetic humanity is towards each other. If closing opposition can prove that humanity is more empathetic and actually provide those mechanisms, we are going to be the team that wins this debate. Note opening opposition only notes trends are happening currently, but they give you no reason as to why these trends are happening. This means that under opening opposition's case, we have no reason to believe it's going to happen in 100 years' time. These are the reasons they're going to be provided exclusively by Zagreb A. But before that, just a response to CG's corporate capture. I may be crazy, but I don't think they ever give a reason as to why that's necessarily a bad thing. 4 responses. First of all, control of information has always existed in society. Plausibly, it existed more in history. Like kings and churches control what information is disseminated to people. People were factually illiterate. People did not have the ability to vote. They only had the information that was dogmatically given to them via the doctrine of divine right. What is comparative is that today we have more capability to challenge that via social networks which make us connected to each other. Note that even in authoritarian regimes, like when the Arab Spring began because people were able to connect over social networks. So we have more customer scrutiny today because people are far more informed about the products they are buying. They have more access to information. To the extent to which there is always an actor which controls information, people are far more able to challenge that actor today. Secondly, they never show why these algorithms they talk about are bad. These algorithms exist because people had preferences and then the algorithms were tailored for the preferences of the people were. We say we have more tailoring to people's preferences. We also say comparatively, corporations, due to competition and innovation, are probably the best providers of goods and services because they have to keep prices at a rate that are going to be accessible to people, and also because they're easier to challenge than states because they do not have the violent power of the army and the police. They're exclusively challenged via whether you consume their products or not. So to the extent to which competition exists, we're able to challenge them. Thirdly, status symbols existed in any part of history. Like your clothes discerned whether you were a member of the nobility or whether you were a serf in the 14th century. Slaves were forced to walk barefoot because it made them visually distinct from other people. Completely uncomparative. Fourthly, on terms of the AI point, if the AI point is true and corporations are going to develop AI, then your corporations are going to destroy themselves. Because if the AI completely replaces the entirety of the workforce, then you have no consumers to consume your products. This means that corporations never have an incentive to develop it to the extent to which you claim. Okay, moving on to our case. Very simply, why is empathy important at the end of the day? Because instead of having fear that because everybody is different from someone else in some kind of way, you are going to be attacked because of this difference and therefore you act defensively, you are more likely to sympathize with the troubles of others and try to help them because in contrast, you have confidence that they're going to help you. This is what makes it easier to tackle global issues and create some kind of intergovernmental consensus. It makes it easier for us to build tolerance that opening opposition so much wants. What are the mechanisms for this? First of all, we are more likely to have more insight into others' emotions. And in terms of interconnectedness, is we develop technology that directly will allow us to experience things from the point of view of other people. Note virtual reality is a kind of this technology. For the first time, probably, we are going to be able to live through a situation through somebody else's point of view. Note that the reason why we have the Me Too movement today, not 20 years ago, is because the internet allowed people to communicate their personal stories which resonated with personal emotions. The development of technology, to the extent to which it probably allows us to have a more direct insight into people's emotions and surpass language, is probably going to be on our side. Secondly, we have more global threats, right? Climate change is potentially on our side. We know that some people will die. We know that some land will be lost.
But humanity has shown a tendency that when there's a global threat, it unites and creates intergovernmental consensus because empathy happens because you realize that anybody's going to die the same way you did. This is what happened in World War II. It literally bridged the Cold War divide between the US and the USSR. This is probably what's going to happen to our side. Empathy grows because there are more global problems because of the interconnectedness of the world. This means that people are more likely to see past identities. This is where we mechanize opening opposition. Unless opening government can prove that everybody is wiped out due to climate change, we have more prosperity once humanity adapts. Given that the closing government claims the development of AI is going to be so huge, probably this also means we're going to have capabilities to adapt to the conditions created by climate change. Note today we inhabit areas 100 years ago were uninhabitable. But also, there's far more individualism on our side, and that's a good thing. Why does individualism happen? Because there are far more different career paths you can take today, because there are many different forms of leisureable activity which you can undertake. Also, there's a proliferation of different identities. What does individualism mean? Individualism means that you realize that it is the most important thing in your life is for you to realize your definition of happiness. This consequentially makes you more capable to understand that other people have their own distinct definitions of what happiness means for them. Therefore, it makes you far more able to understand the other people and tolerate it. That is opposed to collectivism, which necessitates that you have a unifying idea, a unifying ideology, and a unified goal. Given you cannot define this for all of the people in the world, collectives necessarily clash with each other. So to the extent to which progress opens new career paths, opens new ways in which we can develop ourselves and have new experiences, it makes us more distinct from each other. To the extent which makes us more distinct from each other, it dismantles collectivism. It makes us far more able to understand that all of us have different positions and are equally entitled to happiness. This is also where we dismantle OO. But before I move on, I'm going to take opening.
The problem with empathy is that it's still channeled through systems that have collective action problems where individuals are short-termists and impacts of things are oftentimes felt unequally. People in countries that are being affected by climate change now are not the people with power, therefore they can't be changed because there isn't a source of...
There is an existential threat to a human being from climate change. This also applies to people in power. They're probably incentivized to change it when they see that people are going to start dying. Some people are going to die, but it's going to be solved. Note that the Paris Agreement was unimaginable 20 years ago. This is because people know that the world has come up to their throats and they have started solving it. Note that. We also say it's probably more likely that nation states and national identities are going to erode on our side because of the proliferation of identities. We see that it's already happening with the European Union. This means there's more possibility for intergovernmental consensus on our side. Fifthly, we say probably there's going to be an erosion of religion for two reasons. First of all, technology is more advanced, meaning we have less need to explain abstract things with religion. Secondly, we are more aware of the depths and vastness of space, and potentially we discover new life forms. This directly defeats the primary narrative of religions that we are the chosen people of God. Why is that necessarily a good thing? Because, we see this trend today with more people are atheistic. Because religions are necessarily dogmatic and exclusionary to a group of people, because they necessarily need the narrative of us versus them in order to keep us emotionally involved. We also think religion is coercive to the extent you're born into it and don't choose it. So it's also a principal point on our side. We mechanize our vote, we take down both governments. Zagreb A, for the last time this tournament, very proud to oppose.
Well, the problem with that extension is that they say that the future will, for various reasons, break down the collectivist way that people define themselves ethically. Then there is a missing premise. And then they say, now people can see each other's actual value. They say, well, now I don't have to see you as a woman or a man or as an ethnic group. I can see you as an actual person. But there was never any reason given by closing opposition as to why that would be what people would change to. And we told you what people would actually change to, which is that capital will increasingly divide and conquer people by making them and encouraging them to prioritize themselves and their own selfish interests above anyone else, and therefore not to relate to anyone else or empathize with anyone else. That the information that they will increasingly receive will be distorted and biased against certain groups in favor of political or corporate interests. And in the case that it's not, it will merely be disorienting. It will be an endless list of fragmentary moral concerns that you're meant to empathize with that will actually make you apathetic ultimately. That will make you incapable of acting upon moral actions. And that is why closing opposition's benefit of empathy is exactly what will no longer exist in 100 years. So, let's now talk about this debate as a whole. I think the problem with opening opposition is essentially that they lack imagination. They seem to think that, well, last year to this year, democracy grew stronger and minority rights grew stronger. So this year to next year, that'll probably happen again. And in 100 years, it'll just be that, times 100. But what we told you is that the mechanisms that they relied on for that growth in the status quo will become shattered and distorted in the future. Let me list those mechanisms. Number one, they said minorities and inequality will continue to be fixed for the reason of democracy. But as Kevin tells you, democracy will be eroded and sold, because that is how corporations, when they grow so incredibly significant and influential, when they have the capacity to influence governments, because people increasingly find it difficult to hold governments to account when there's an infinite amount of information that is difficult to sift through, and because corporations are very, very good at hiding these things, that is when you get the extraordinarily harmful situations that opening opposition actually is afraid of. And then I think in a response to a point of information, I think DLO says, well, yes, but it would still be better to live in the UK in China right now, but it will not be like China right now, for the reason that we know that corporations, when they have reasons to throw people under the bus in favor of their corporations, do that every time. For example, in the status quo, we always see things like in Brazil, we see oil companies just driving over land that is sacred to some indigenous groups for the reason that they think that there is oil that is significant to them there. Those are all reasons to believe that for the reason that they're not democratically accountable, they will trample on minority rights. Minority rights will fall backwards. Secondly, they said that there will be connections and information that will encourage people to relate to each other, and then their closing essentially repeats that. The problem with that is what we told you. Number one, that information will be extraordinarily politically manipulated. And they say, well, it's just to do with your preferences. But I don't think Cambridge Analytica was to do with anyone's preferences. I think it was interference in the political system, which will become increasingly common as the tools become increasingly sophisticated. And then they say, most absurdly, that, well, information has always been politically dominated. Kings used to decide what you got to read and didn't read. Yes, they did. In the status quo, there is extremely limited control of the amount of information because corporations have not yet, figured out how to do it or totally, clamped down upon information use. In 100 years, we'll be back to how the kings were. We'll be back to reading only what they want us to read. And that is exactly how we fall back as a society rather than travel forward. And secondly, the problem with that information was that it was morally fragmented. Because the premise of opening opposition's case was that the connections meant that people actually cared more about each other. But they don't. They actually care less. If you think about the direction of feminism right now, it is more and more towards empty virtue signaling and protests that achieve nothing, rather than actually doing anything significant or material for the women who need it. And that is the trend for social progress that we're going to see into the future. So that is why the connections and information are also going to get worse in the future. Another reason by OO's own metric that the future will be worse. Thirdly, they said that there are incentives to spread the wealth because you want to create stability and you want people to work for you. But Kevin's extension responds to that perfectly as well. Because technological progress will, number one, make it very unnecessary for you to need people to work for you. It will be easy for you to mechanize most of your labor, at which point, if workers strike, you don't care because you do not need them. At the point at which workers rebel, you don't care because you have the technological largesse to easily just rebuff that revolution, which will all mean that the incentives to spread the wealth, which previously in history have existed, will no longer exist in 100 years. And fourthly, they relied extremely significantly on technological growth. And they say that that technological... Actually, I'll take closing if you've got one first, before I get to
the Me Too movement was a direct consequence of the fact that we stopped emphasizing collective class issues and started emphasizing that we have to listen to individual stories and individual experiences. Direct result of progress in communication and individualism as opposed to collectives being opposed to each other.
I think you vastly overestimate the success of the Me Too movement. We fired a few actors. Brett Kavanaugh is still confirmed as a Supreme Court judge. We don't see any legal reform in the United States. For the most part, those are protesting in vain against states that will never change in the face of oppression, for the reasons that they have no incentive to change, because they're increasingly controlled by interests that are not the people. So, finally, in terms of technology, firstly, they said, opening opposition says, well, it'll probably be gradual, it won't be that hard. But, the development of technology in the last 30 years has been explosive. 30 years ago, we did not have the internet. Facebook and Google, some of the most influential corporations in the world, did not exist, that is going to continue, and Kevin gives you lots of reasons why, number one, it will be extremely difficult to control the aims of artificial intelligence, because to control it to be able to learn for itself and reprogram itself is very difficult to, also have it to believe what we think is moral, at which point there is a significant chance of disaster. And secondly, the most realistic thing that will happen is just that corporations that develop affirmative intelligence will just create products for the rich to use. For the rich to use to derive more and more capital from creating more products for themselves. That is when inequality gets locked in forever. That is when the entire working class becomes meaningless and loses every power that they ever had. That is why closing government should win this debate.
We had so many SL jokes, but the situation is pretty dire, so let's be very smooth straight on. So we don't think we solved all of the issues on our side of the house, but comparatively, Brent Kavanaugh is still a Supreme Court justice, which sucks to be honest, but we know he probably most likely is a total and complete asshole. Comparatively, you don't get that on your side of the house because Me Too movement doesn't rise in. You don't get the complaints raised of him, which motivated by the people raising complaints before. Secondly, his cabinet is now full of women because he needed to somehow get the storm down, which means that he nominated all of the women in his cabinet, which means that other people are going to follow. It's going to be harder to not include, for example, women when you are a next judge. And thirdly, for example, the Democrats rising on the way of the shit that happens right here might nominate a woman for the next Supreme Court judge. They are not being comparative when they say, oh, but Me Too movement hasn't achieved anything. Literally, there was a debate about that in the Euros finals, and it was a really good one, and we have impacts regardless of. Look, the growth of tolerance in the status quo and throughout history directly correlates with the growth of individualism. When you are more individualistic, that means you expect people to care more about your rights, and you expect people to care less about how someone else is going to feel. That's the impact that we bring into this debate. That means that you embrace your subjective definition of happiness, something that's good for you and you only, maybe for your family if you derive individualism through that, but it's still comparatively less in terms of collectivism, which means that you as an individual care more about yourself and you care more about your happiness. Comparatively, in a world where you care about other people's happiness, where you care about the happiness of the state, where you care about the happiness of your school, where you care about the happiness of people who surround you, you are less happy, and that's when you get bad things on their side. But recognize that we also give you the impact through empathy, and empathy is not something that's contradictory to individualism in the status quo, because you can still be a strong individualist, you can still care about your issues, but you can still be empathetic to other people's issues. In fact, when you prioritize and see your issues, when you don't have this general actor of collectivism being wrong, that's when you can garner more empathy for other reasons. Also, another reason why we think people will be more tolerant is the specific research into genetic origins of gender and race and stuff like that, which defeat the idea or the premise that some race or some people are superior to other people. Let's compare us in this debate and what have we done. First, on CG. They have this idea that capital is a unifying factor in their comparative world where corporations take over. We say that's really good. We say the will to acquire capital unites you more than, for example, all of the things that you have today in the nation state. So even if their world happens, we say that still people will be united towards this one goal where they are going to be measured by the idea of how they get capital, not about their identity. So insofar as they want to prove that people are going to be more equal, that's good on our side of the house. But as I already explained, in the terms of the social issues and social changes in the feminism point, they don't respond to our argument, which was made in thin speeches. But moreover, on the corporations taking over, literally, there's no competition between nation states in the status quo, or there's very little one. Not a lot of people can move and stop being in the nation and move somewhere else. Comparatively, if corporations take over, there's competition between corporations, which means that you, as someone who both nation states and corporations cater to, you have more agency under their world, even if it happens. And we're not saying it happens. They didn't prove why this is going to like happen, but you have more leverage over these corporations than you do in the status quo, especially if you are someone who is like gerrymandered and stuff like that over your national government. We say corporations, given that they care about you to the effect that they want you to buy your product, care about you more than the governments you have in the status quo. Also, some of the things that are unique to nation states are out of this debate with corporations, such as like historical tensions, such as religion and stuff like that. I will talk about you, so you can maybe ask after this. Yeah. So, in terms of climate change, we say that we will be more adaptable. There's going to be new types of housing. There's going to be more efficient agriculture. We are going to inhibit areas that were uninhabitable, like in the status quo. That only happened to compare like 200 years ago, because we live in mountains, we live out in the sea and stuff like that. Things that were not possible. But more specifically, in terms of like solar energy, wind and fusion, like in terms of nuclear energy, autarky with planetary forces is more likely on our side of the house, and that's something that we see as a benefit. But we already did that kind of, like, we adapted the species to climate change before. We survived the ice age, people were living through the ice age, where there was also like rising sea levels, where the temperature was really bad. We say we are now in a far better situation, even if climate change is really, really worse, the worst thing can happen, and there's been a lot of like meteoric stuff along our nature, why it's not going to be the worst, we say it's still going to happen. Their idea of but Trump is now in power is simply wrong, because you have Al Gore, you have Obama, you have Trump, and now you have Macron. So it's not that dire, it's simply like a cutoff point, and then it's going to be back again, because we react to this. Even though if we go up like CEO's point in terms of if we are like not able to, for example, like survive, that we are more prone to like danger, that's a good thing. That's literally the best mechanism people have in order to fight things. If people are like more susceptible to damage, that means that they are going to fight this problem sooner. That's the basic survivalist mechanism that have brought us like shelter and food and some of the stuff that have benefited us hugely before. I'll take opening now.
Note that we told you why likely the type of technology that are developed are the ones that are the most profitable for companies that are determinist on the short term, which means you don't get lasting change. You get Teslas that are produced that aren't actually impactful on the environment. Please engage with the fact that millions of people will die because emissions will continue to increase.
But you're talking about now. The same logic could be applied to people saying, but Tesla is never going to be able to churn out the amount of like cars that are churning out now, and they are doing it in the status quo. So in terms of like 20 or 50 years, it was unimaginable you had a car that runs on electricity like 15 years ago, we still did it. So just because there are some failures in the status quo doesn't mean the trend is as you try to portray. Also, the thing about recycling is that's the first time we have like changed the narrative about consumption. We are more effective. We want to consume less things. That's a huge benefit of our side. You're literally changing the thing of how people perceive consumption and economic consuming once you actually combat climate change. That's a good side on our. We can like totally rechange our economic system and stuff like that. Lastly, on the comparative withdrawal, Martin talked this was a priority of his speech. Like how to split the pie is more important here, and we get it better in terms of social issues, we get better in tackling some of the things that come from a government bench in this debate, than how big the pie is. Because it responds better to their arguments about like, but the pie is going to be unevenly split, or the pie is going to be such split that you're going to have climate change, and it gives all a mechanism for this. Lastly, I forgot to mention this earlier. So the thing is, like, if they want to claim that there's going to be like very few people at the top in terms of like corporate, that they, like the corporations are simply do not have incentive to get to a very small amount of people. They have the incentive to increase the market and to get more people out of it. We were very proud to speak in these times. Yeah.